Exceptions are errors in running code that are beyond the programmer's control. Like maybe you're trying to open up a file, or the user's trying to open up a file that doesn't exist, or the user enters in the wrong thing in the wrong format. They're asked to enter in a date, and instead they enter in a name. Those are things beyond the programmer's control, but we can handle them with exception handling. Now, these are not syntax errors. We cannot catch exceptions of syntax errors. Those are errors that the programmer did. The programmer typed in a statement incorrectly, forgot to put a semicolon at the end of the line, forgot to put in the right number of arguments. Those are syntax errors, cannot be handled with exception handling. And before exception handling, if the user, say, tried to open up a file that didn't exist, or the user tried to enter in a number when they were supposed to enter in a date, the program would halt performance and would crash. And I'm going to show you how to handle these errors in both console applications and Windows Forms applications. We'll start here with a console application. And one change I need to make in my using statements up here, these are parts of the .NET framework that I want to use. I'm going to be opening up a text file in my code, so I want to use a part of the .NET framework called system.io, and IO stands for input output. And that allows me to use the file class and methods like open for read access, like I'm going to do here. So my comments here, I'll zoom this in, try to open up the sample.txt text file and catch any exceptions. Well, that sample.txt file is located inside of, here's the solution folder, inside of the bin folder and inside of the debug folder. This is actually the folder of code that gets generated when your code compiles and you run by clicking this start button. So here's an exe of my file that I could run, and I created a folder called my folder, and inside of my folder is a file called sample.txt. All right, so I'm going to try to open up that file and catch any exceptions. So let's try. File, and that file is a class inside of the system.io namespace, and I'm going to open with read access. What file? My folder 2, that's the path, or my folder, excuse me, /sample.txt, and this needs to be inside of quotes. This is a string, it's also a file name, and so that's what I'm going to try to do. And if that is unsuccessful, I want to catch any of the exceptions or any of the errors. Okay, and EX is just a variable name that I created, but it's common when you're catching general exceptions. Sorry, this should not be plural, exception EX. And if I do catch an error, I want to write that error to the console. So console.writeLine the exception, and that's the exception from right up here, and convert that to a string. So that's all that's happening in this code besides waiting for a key press from the user. So let's run this, and it ran fine. It did not catch any exceptions. So let's go back to my folder that has this sample.txt file, and let's change its file name to sample2.txt. And now if I try to open sample.txt, that file is not going to exist. So I'm not seeing any syntax errors here, right? Nothing has red squiggly marks underneath it. My code seems fine, but if I run this, now I catch this error. And it's this big, long, scary description of the error that the compiler found, and still we have the press any key to terminate the program. So the important thing is that my program did continue to run through the end of the main method, but it caught this error. Now this is a system.io.filenotfound exception. And instead of giving this big, long, scary message, I want to give the user a more friendly error message, something that doesn't provide them with all of this scary information. And so instead of catching a general exception like we did here, I can catch specific exceptions. And we catch specific exceptions before we catch general exceptions. So I want to catch a file not found exception. And so if that is caught, I can write something a little more friendly to the user, like I cannot find that file. Okay. So let's run this now. The only thing I changed is I added this code to it, and we're not going to see the big scary error message. We're just going to see I cannot find that file. And program execution continued. Press any key to terminate the program. Great. Let's catch another type of exception. So say, let's go back to my folder, and I'll change this back to sample.txt. And let's say I try to open up sample.txt inside of my folder 2. Now my folder doesn't exist. I don't have that folder in my debug folder, so when I run this, I'm going to catch another type of exception. This is a directory not found exception. A different exception like what we found before, and again, it's the general exception that's catching this and giving me this big scary message. Now, I want to catch a directory not found exception and provide the user with a more friendly error message. So I can do that up here. I want to catch a directory not found exception. And when I catch a directory not found exception, I want to tell the user just like that. So now when I run this, it's again looking for sample.txt inside of my folder 2, which doesn't exist, and we get this nicer error message, I cannot find that directory. Okay, and if there were any other sort of exception found, maybe the file is protected and I can't open that protected file. Well, there's probably another exception that's trying to open up a protected file exception, and that's going to be caught in the general exception. So the user, if they do one of these more common things, like give an incorrect directory or give an incorrect file, will give them a friendly error message. But if they do something that is not one of those two things but still throws an exception, they'll get that long scary message, which is better than nothing and better than the program crashing. So I just want to show you without error handling what we would see if we just tried to open up this file in my folder 2. And I try to run this. So here's where the program would crash. The user would not see any sort of error message. They just get an error, and that's not very good. That's why we like to have these try-catch statements in our code. Alright, so that's in a console application. Let's now look at error handling in a Windows Forms application. I'll zoom in on this. So here's the form I have. It's pretty simple, and I'm asking the user if they want to make a donation to the Save the Humpback Whale Foundation, yes or no, and then another text box. And when the user clicks multiply by 2, I want a message box to show up with whatever number is typed in here doubled. Now, up here in the first half of the form, I want to demonstrate the old way of catching exceptions. So if the user typed in something besides yes or no, how can we catch that? And we can catch that with a standard if statement. So I'm going to double click on the submit button and write some code in here for whenever that submit button is clicked. And so if the name of my text box is donation text box, if the text property of that donation text box is yes, then I want to show a message box that says, thank you for your donation. And say they, let's do an else if. Say they typed in no into the text box. In that case, I want to say maybe another time. And then else, all right, so else, they did not type in yes and they did not type in no. What do I want to do? I want to show a message box that says please enter a valid response. Okay, so this is a way of catching errors, right? Obviously I don't have any more logic in this program that does something with, if they said yes to the donation, but that code would be in there somewhere, and we don't want to halt execution if they don't type in the word yes or no. We want to provide them with a friendly response that says, wait a second, I don't recognize that. The only thing that you can type into this text box is yes or no. So let's give this a run, and yes, they do want to make a donation. That works. No, they don't want to make a donation. Maybe another time. That's working. But what if they type in something like this? What happens now? Please enter a valid response. All right. Now, without this if statement, we would be passing along this C# error handling string to some other method that probably wouldn't know what to do with it, right? And so that's a way, without using those try-catch blocks, to catch an error but from user input. But we are going to use a try-catch block in this second half of the form. So obviously what needs to be typed in here is, well, I'm going to make it an integer. And if they type in, C# into this box, well, that's not something that we can multiply by 2. And so we're going to catch that error. First thing I want to do here is declare an integer variable for number, and that'll work, and a variable for answer. So try to double the number and display the answer in a message box. So I'm going to try this. What am I going to try? That's in my first set of curly braces. I want to try converting whatever is typed into the text box into an integer. And the name of my text box is number text box, but I want to access the text property of that number text box. There we go. So I'm going to try to convert that and then multiply it by 2. And then I want to show that answer in a message box. I need to convert that to a string because a message box, unlike console.writeLine, can only show a string. And so if I just had answer in here, answer is an integer, and I need to display a string inside of a message box. So that will work. So that's what I'm trying here. And let's again just start by trying to catch a general exception. And if there is an exception, then I want to put that exception on the in a message box. Good. So EX is a data type of exception. Exception is a data type just like string, just like integer, just like double, just like Boolean. And by itself, a message box can't show an exception object, but it can show an exception object converted to a string. Okay, so now let's run this and look at the bottom half of our form. So if I type in 6 here and multiply by 2, I get 12. Great, that's doubling my numbers. 18 multiplied by 2, 36. That's working. But what if the user typed in hello here and multiply by 2? We have a system.format exception. And again, a long, scary description. Another thing is, notice that I converted this to an integer 16. Integer 16 only uses 16 bits, and so it doesn't take very many characters before we've overloaded an integer 16, so this number can't be represented in 16 bits. If I try to multiply this by 2, I get a system.overflow exception. Value is too large or too small for an integer 16. So now I have two errors that I want to catch. And so let's catch those. Again, we do this above the general exception here. And I want to catch a format exception first. That's when they're trying to type in maybe a date or a string when I want them to type in an integer. And if that's the case, let's display a message box that says that isn't a number. Please try again. Okay. And then let's catch that overflow exception if they're trying to type in a number that's too large for an integer 16. And if they do that, let's display a message box saying your number is too large. Okay. Good, so we're catching a format exception, we're catching an overflow exception, and then we're catching a general exception if there's still another exception. Let's give this a run. And my form still works. 7 multiplied by 2 is 14. But now if they type in, hi, that isn't a number. Please try again. Oh, that's a lot nicer than that big, scary, long message we had before. Or if they're trying to type in too large of a number for an integer 16, there we go. Your number is too large. Oh, I see. My calculator can only handle smaller numbers, and that works.